And like Joe Rogan likes to say, we're live.
Okay.
Evan Thompson, good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, this is exciting.
Looking forward to this. So, we're going to be talking about realism as a philosophical current, as a school of philosophy. And this comes from us having been in a conversation before where we were talking about the topic of Machiavelli and how he's applicable to business. And that is the reason why we're here, because when my wife listened to the podcast, she was like, oh my God, you have to do that again and go more in depth on this topic. And I find it also intriguing. There's not a lot of discussion where we're connecting the ancient world with our modern world. I think we are not respectful enough to our elders. And I really liked, and this is one of the things we bonded over, is that you are somebody who respects our ancestors and forefathers a great deal and is drawing on this intellectual tradition for just, pure intellectual edification, business advantage. So yeah, I was really looking forward to exploring that with you.
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's obviously where our relationship started. And I mean, I've talked about this in several instances, including my book as well, where I highlight the kind of the difficulty within business where there's not an ancient library of business topics, and but at the same time, I think we should be compelled to try to draw from, the oldest ideas we can find. And find a way to bring them forward, and in a way that's kind of a bit an interest of mine, and I'm doing more and more with respect to that, I think.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. Cool. So I thought where we should start, and by the way, whoever is watching, feel free to drop in questions in the comment section. We'll cover them as they come in. But I thought a good place to start would be not to get straight deep into the philosophical part, just so that we get some foundations. You will tell us a little bit about where you're coming from on this, because this topic is, of course, mainly coming from you. I'm mostly an interested spectator. I'm not as deep in realism as you are, not nearly as deep. But before we get into the theoretical foundations, let's briefly discuss one of the areas where it actually really applied recently, and that was our recent call that we had with a prospective client, where we were talking to them about where we could support them in. And so just to give everyone listening a context, Evan and I are independent consultants. We work with different types of clients, but with one specific prospect who I knew, I thought that it would be useful to bring in Evan, because I thought it would be a great complement to what I do. And together, and with another friend of Evan's, we would sort of business associate, we would be a great triumvirate of consultants who could help them with their toughest problems. So we had them on a call, and at the end of the call, Evan laughed and said, well, if this wasn't a great example of where Evan, was running the realism track, and you, Michael, were more on the idealistic side, I don't know what was. So I think, Evan, if you could tell us from your point of view, where did that manifest? How did that call go? And of course, we won't mention names, but if you could simply elaborate a little bit on where the realism came in.
Yeah, it came in, I would say, in a few spots in the middle, and definitely at the end, where the lines between you and well, first of all, it was actually really fun, right? It was the first time you and I were technically on a sales call together.
Yeah.
Which is just like, okay, well, that's already, why would we do that even? It's maybe a good idea, but without practice or without any
without much preparation.
With hardly any preparation, with barely any coordination. And we call our group, our business, whatever, our unity of three consultants, speculation. So that should already maybe add more context, right? This is purely speculation, prospecting on a completely new business idea. Who knows what'll happen? But in the call, like I was definitely picking up on some core interests, core immediate demands that they had, and so I was willing, like, okay, yes, like that's just. I'm going to directly speak to that, because that is where their minds are right now. It's not all that I would have wanted to have done, or that I knew you would have wanted to have done, or that our other partner would have wanted to have done, or that we could have done. It certainly doesn't encompass all of that. But the goal, it wasn't, in my opinion, to sell on every possible thing in the first conversation. It was to, sell a minimum viable product of things that were agreed upon and understood right now, and as trust is built and as results are given, to expand that over time, kind of in an incremental way. Whereas you were insisting on continuing to talk about this really important thing that they needed to do with their marketing, which of course I agreed with, but they just didn't want to hear at that time. And you were driving that point home. And obviously we had different tactics and so, it's all of that. So I'm not necessarily saying entirely about right or wrong, but it revealed a difference in style.
Yeah.
And again, like I said too, like if it were any other call, my realism could have been off-putting. You know what I mean? But maybe not though. But
yeah, no, I mean, just to put it a little bit more concrete, what we wanted to, at least what we were presenting to them, were two separate areas, right? So we of course work in the area of lead generation, client acquisition, growing their business, marketing and sales. And so the area where it turns out that they needed the most help was to get a little bit more predictability in their current MQL-based client acquisition methodology.
Yeah.
And what my approach was to say that, yes, absolutely, there is work to be done in this area. You largely seem to not know where your leads are coming from, what compels them to start the conversation with you, and it's all relatively, it's unknown. It's just, you just simply don't seem to know what predicts a possibly good lead, right? And in the meantime, you get a lot of people downloading your content, and then you are prospecting with them, and the lead scoring also does not predict the success. So there's definitely work to be done in that. However, this is just a small part of the clients who are possibly looking to become clients. In reality, there's this vast ocean of people who need to be educated about your product, and this is where demand gen comes in. And so I was also not at length, it wasn't like I was trying to push them in that direction, but I was saying that this would be an additional thing to also work on. And their reaction was pretty clearly, no, we will not do any demand gen. We are very ROI driven right now.
Yeah.
So we would be only interested in that first part.
Yes.
To which I then said, okay, then, because the time was also ending, I suggested that we would be following up with an email, right? And just telling them this is what we would be doing for them. And just, if you could quickly reiterate what you would have said at that point.
I would have said, thanks guys for the call. It was great to get to meet all of you, but I'm not sure if we're the right fit.
Okay.
For a lot of reasons. And one of the biggest ones is I just don't believe they thought they knew what they were doing, right? So they were confident in what their approach was. So they didn't believe they needed to learn something new there. They didn't want to learn anything new from you, unfortunately. There might be other reasons why that's the case, but but at the end of the day, when I see, it's like, okay, well, in your guys' view, there's a very small problem to solve, and you don't own the company anymore anyway. So how much value can I get out of this deal? Likely not very much. So that's what I saw. And it's just like, we're not looking for clients. We're looking for a very specific type of client where we can provide a very serious amount of transformation over a period of time, and so it was just not the right fit. And that's all. And nothing bad. That's not a bad word, right? It's just, our interests and their interests weren't aligned. And so,
but I mean, just to tie it, and now let's get into the real meat of the topic. I think it showed a real difference in character between us, where I tend to be a little bit preachy, right? A little bit. I try to convert people to my side. While I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It is. It helps me to establish a certain narrative, which in the end for marketing is really good. if you're able to position yourself as somebody who's, for example, going against the grain of the mainstream, and you try to kind of transform the world in a specific direction, then it can really work well for you. And there's countless examples of where marketing with a narrative. You know, the world is going in a different direction. Everybody else is doing it wrong. We are doing it right. Follow us. That kind of transformational narrative marketing can absolutely work. I think on the other hand, where you are very right in this case was that they simply are not the target for us to try to drive this kind of change. It's simply this kind of narrative marketing needs to be done relatively purely inbound, I would say, where you just present it to the world, and if people respond to it, then they take you up on it. But in the end, this is the difference between our approaches, where you essentially, and this is what realism effectively tries to accomplish. It says, look at the world how it is really, and then you adapt to it for your maximum benefit. Is that right? Did I phrase that correctly?
I'll accept that, but I have some foundation to lay over the course of this episode. Yeah,
let's do it. Let's lay the foundation of realism.
But you were talking about change, though, right? And so, and there's a really interesting quote from Machiavelli: "Nothing is more difficult or perilous to undertake than to lead any form of change, because you will have enemies of everyone who benefited from the old system, and only tepid allies, people that could benefit from your change." So it's a hard thing to do. It's always difficult, you know. And so and that doesn't mean don't fight for change. How do things get better? They have to change. Okay. But so it means when you're doing that, it has to be done with the utmost caution, the utmost respect, and the utmost discipline, because it is dangerous. And typically when you try to enact a certain type of change and you do it poorly, you end up actually cementing the cause of change resistance. You know, and then you get unsubstantiated resistance to effective change over time built into a culture. And so that's why it's like, well, wait a minute, we need a change force, and we need a stabilizing force within countries, within societies, within businesses. And those have to both engage, and well, it's going to be more effective if they're both very disciplined and very substantive and engaged appropriately with each other. Otherwise, they start to become irrational ideological forces that aren't looking at data, that aren't looking at opportunities, that aren't properly addressing threats, and either moving in one direction or not moving at all on the basis of superstition.
Could you read that quote again from Machiavelli about change?
I was going from memory, and so
you're going from memory. Wow.
I was probably a little bit off.
Again, there were a few great points in it.
Nothing is more dangerous or perilous to undertake than the institution of some form of change, because you will have enemies of all the people who have benefited from the previous regime, and only lukewarm or tepid allies, the people who will benefit from your change. That's not exactly. I'm like 95% on that quote, though. But yeah,
okay. Yeah, it's that you. The thing is, if you know, what if you know that on the other side of change there is benefit to be had, and especially if you can already point to examples, right? Especially like still tying it to that discussion that we had with our prospect, is that I can point you specifically to examples of people who have done demand gen, companies, right?
Different people, different product, different customer,
different
style, different approach, different personality, different manpower, different strengths, different weaknesses, different threats, different opportunities, different competition, different country, might be a different language. So that's at least enough for anybody to reasonably say, okay, well, this is at minimum not a like for like conversation. And it's most certainly, and I know you can't possibly mean this is, but what if we know what will happen with the change? Okay, no, I'm sorry. That's not real. That's not real. There's no such thing as we're going to change this, and we know exactly how the Plinko pucks are going to fall. if that analogy works in your mind.
Correct. We don't.
So,
we won't know. Okay, but what to make of this? I mean, does that mean that we need to simply accept the world as it is?
well, no, that's what wait a minute. But did you hear me 2 minutes ago? Like we do have the world as it is, and we're dealing with the world as it is. And any change that we bring forward has to have that proper consideration. And it has to account for the risks. It has to account for the difficulties. It has to account for all the differences and variations, different viewpoints, different strengths and weaknesses of people, and an understanding that invariably any change with it at any level will produce a different set of winners and losers to a certain extent, right? Not that winners and losers generally are predetermined by a system, right? A system does gravitate towards a certain benefit, while then at the same time there's a lot of individuality and autonomy within it, right? So, but I mean, just again, right? Like, let's just talk about the most basic thing, like a changing of the tax code. Okay, whether you like it, regardless of your opinion of taxes, regardless of your opinion of state spending, you are definitely producing people who are now getting tax increases and tax benefits, which is to say you are producing a system within this change of people who are getting a benefit from the change and people who are being harmed from that change, at minimum in their perspective, right? So, and you have to deal with perspective rather than simply facts as well. And so, if we're now talking about tax policy change and we're not considering the fact that there are going to be winners and losers, quote unquote, then I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know how you can say that you don't have a substantive, sophisticated understanding of what it is that you're doing. And I think people do that all the time, where they're just like, oh, we're only looking at the benefits. I am the advocate of change, and I'm only looking at the benefits of this change and the people who benefit from it. And I'm going to completely ignore any concept of risks or any group of people or individual or whatever that might lose from this. And that's just, well, lazy and inaccurate.
Of course. And there's several kind of schools of philosophy that really insist on the studying of unintended consequences. And I think I believe Edmund Burke was very strong in this. You're much more of an expert in Burke
He wrote a few letters
that
turned into books on that subject.
Sorry?
He wrote a few letters that turned into books on that subject.
Okay. Let's quickly go into the comments. Barakat gave us the whole quote. It must be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to plan, more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than a new system.
Yep.
For the initiator has the enmity of all who would profit by the preservation of the old institution, and merely lukewarm defenders in those who gain by the new ones. So there was the lukewarm defenders, the tepid defenders, as you phrased it. And then
Very
he
nice.
asked, you're mainly looking for indications that a client is ready and willing to change. Is that wrong? So Barakat is asking, he's asking a question. You're mainly looking for indications that a client is ready and willing to change. Is that wrong? I don't think it is.
No, I'm not necessarily looking for that. No, I'm looking for a client that has plenty of gaps, that has a bunch of value that everybody's aware of, but they don't know how to get to necessarily. Right mentality, personnel. I mean, there's so many factors to consider with what would be the right fit client for me, for you, for us. Some of that comes down to finance as well.
But I think on a more abstract level, I think Barakat is not necessarily asking to us specifically, but I think in the context of this, right, and especially with what we discussed at the beginning with the prospect that we had, yes, we are actually looking for an indication that a client is ready and willing to change. That is ultimately at the core of every sales call. You cannot persuade or cajole somebody into admitting that they have a problem. You may be good at persuading them that once they have admitted the problem and they are willing to act, that they actually go with you as opposed with a competitor. There's maybe some persuasion work to be done, quite
Yeah.
possibly. But you cannot talk your way into a business which has not acknowledged that they have a problem, that they are ready and willing to change. So on that side, you're correct, Barakat. Yeah, cool. Okay, so but let's now go into the foundations. I mean, you in preparation for this, you gave me a great breakdown of realism as a philosophical tradition. So could you give us a high-level overview on these specific points, maybe starting with the ancients, starting with Thucydides?
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, like realism is a massive, set of theories and set of ideas. It has a philosophical history that extends back at least 2,500 years. But if we were looking for, who is the grandfather of all of this, we'd probably say Thucydides, Greek historian, writer, and brilliant. You should read him. But anyway, Thucydides' work is pretty impactful. A lot of his thinking you could generally summarize as like, yep, that's realism. And then if we were to be generous and say that Thucydides was far more historian than he was philosopher and literary figure, and again, that's up for some debate about whether he was writing histories or whether he was molding histories into the history he would prefer to tell, philosophically speaking. That's debatable. But if we were to be generous and say this is more history, we could say then, okay, well, then there's a lot within ancient Greece that we could see as quite a bit of realism. So that's kind of a little bit of a backdrop there. So Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, which recounts the war between Athens and Sparta and how that impacted the Greek city-states over time. There's one phrase from it that's very, very famous and called the Melian dialogue, or the dialogue at Milos. Very long dialogue between the Athenian diplomats and the leadership of the island of Milos. Basic context was Milos was trying to declare neutrality and say, we're not involved in this conflict. We want to trade with Athens. We want to trade with Sparta. We're not taking sides. And so Sparta does not have a navy. Milos is an island. Athens has the largest navy in the Greek city-states. So, from the Athenians' perspective, is it just like, you guys really don't have an option? So we're in charge of the sea right now. Your choices are to work with us or to, be obliterated. And Milos takes up the stance, a more idealistic stance, a more values-based stance, law-based stance, or appealing to anything else other than the fact that their island is currently surrounded by warships and they're outnumbered, and so they're not facing the facts in front of them. And there's a very famous phrase from that dialogue that people would fairly summarize as like, okay, boom, that's where realism, put its handprint in the wet cement for the first time in history. And it goes, since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So that secondary part of the phrase, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That one, a lot of people have probably heard that. The preceding phrase I find to be as important, a commentary on when we're talking about right and wrong, we imply that the people having that conversation are equal in power. Otherwise, if they were not equal in power, this would not be a conversation about ethics, but a conversation about, well, I'm here and you're here. So therefore, and obviously, yeah, that's brutal, right? So the importance of that statement, though, and this is not an advocacy for a world to be constructed on the basis of predation. We have laws, we have police, we have order, we have crime and punishment, we have balancing of powers internationally. By the way, all of these are realist principles. Keep in mind, okay? We put in these real checks and balances on power that are backed by guns and people willing to fight, and military alliances to keep actual predation at bay, because predation has never been stopped in human history on the basis of people standing up chanting moral phrases. So so that's realism. Power exists in the world. If you people with more power will inevitably make the decisions over people who have less power. Nations who have more power, businesses who have more power. That is what's happening. What point in time in history has it not been happening? And there's been 1,000 people screaming ought all along the way. And that is not governing society. And we can talk about fair. We can talk about, we can have conversations about this, and people do have conversations about this. And yet, what remains? And I look at this, when I think about this from an organizational perspective, from a business perspective, I think this is perfectly applicable. For example, actually, before I became a consultant, I worked in the nonprofit community. I was a humanitarian. I worked in economic development. And I remember I was in a training in the Philippines. I was at the Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute, and I was taking a course on conflict-sensitive economic governance. Great course. The professor was a PhD from London School of Economics. Brilliant guy. He was Filipino as well. And he gave a great theory. He was trying to teach all these humanitarians, a room full of idealists. I was the realist in the room. He was trying to teach us. And so I loved this guy, by the way, because he was a realist. And he was like, listen, all you peacekeepers, all you humanitarians, here's what's going to happen. Big business and big government are going to sit down and they're going to make a deal together. And you're not going to like that deal unless you find a way to actually sit at that table. And if all you do is protest and have hashtags and get people all riled up, people are just going to get riled up, and they're still going to make that deal, and you're not going to have any participation. So you need to engage in some realism to actually sit down at the table and be involved in the grand bargain between businesses and governments, because that is what has happened, and it is what will continue to happen. So if you want to enact positive change, or if you want to enact a type of humanitarian change, you actually have to engage in realist activities. And that was totally, again, I had never heard anybody say that in that field. And I absolutely loved it. I don't think he changed anybody's minds, unfortunately. And I think we still see many of those problems in the world.
What were the most common counter arguments to his points from the room full of idealists?
Business bad, government bad.
I meant arguments. I didn't mean just shouts into the void.
I've summarized them though.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
okay.
But the point is that's not the case, right? Like the kind of like that Machiavelli quote, where we are, when we're enacting change or when we're doing anything, we have unknown outcomes that are unfolding. It is dangerous and perilous, and it is hard to undertake. And there's another Machiavelli phrase that's just let no government, and again, I wouldn't just say government, let no individual, let no city, let no business, let no nonprofit organization think that it is going to be engaging in assured outcomes or safe choices, but rather risky, dangerous choices that are unknown. That's the constant future we're running into. But okay, I'm sorry, I'm drifting off a bit. I'm trying to stay, I'm trying to honor the foundation I'm trying to build here. Point being, Melian dialogue at Milos, Thucydides, power is a thing that exists in the world, and it is governing the world. And businesses, countries, individuals who are stronger ultimately are making decisions over that which is weak. And that is what has happened. It is what is happening, and it is likely exactly how that is going to continue. So if we ignore that principle, we're just going to be missing. It's like ignoring mathematics. 2 is greater than 1. It is, I think, approximately the mathematical expression of the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And so I don't see this as a call to brutality. I see it as a call to make yourself strong. First and foremost, that would be the realist maxim: become strong.
Okay, can I quickly interject?
Yeah.
Yes, it is a call towards becoming strong yourself, but isn't it also a call to implement institutions so that those who cannot make themselves strong do not suffer, I want to say unduly, but what is due suffering?
Yeah.
It sounds like, because it is such a Darwinian principle, and of
Mhm.
course in the Hobbesian pre-state natural state, I know it only in German, but in the original state that people are in, it is a war of everyone against everyone, and I'm sure you'll get to that. But isn't the moral imperative, besides trying to get strong yourself, which of course I 100% agree with, this is what you also have to teach your children,
Yep.
that it's not, the world will not conform to you. You have to be strong to withstand the slings and arrows of
Okay.
outrageous fortune. That's your goal. But aren't we also, by virtue of this fact, compelled to protect the weak one way or another?
Yeah, no, I think a society is incentivized to, and this has become increasingly true, I think, as the world has become richer and richer. We see a society all societies, businesses included, attempt to become broader and more diverse, because they're seeing, wait a minute, we do have this unknown future that we're rolling into, where we don't know what fight we're going to have tomorrow, type of a thing. Okay, so maybe a great way to put it would be like, if you were to ask a realist, how much power do I need? And the realist is going to say, well, I don't know. Who am I going to be fighting 10 years from now?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know. Okay, so I would like as much as possible, please. Right? So now, what constitutes power? Like, when we think about the word power, we just think like this means like a fist punching somebody in the face. And it's like, well, that's not it, right? Like, that's not it at all. We have, part of that is the power of speech, the power of values, the power of cooperation, of teamwork, of intellect, of creativity, of design. These are all things of providing welfare for people. Again, if we were to think about the first welfare program, it's ever the first and one of the largest per capita welfare programs that's ever existed. Do you know what it was? And who did it? Julius fucking Caesar. The grain dole. He fed 1 million people in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Consistently. So like, there was a Caesar. When comes such another, right? So that's how you get statements like that said about you, when you prevent millions of people from starving for several years. So on the basis of your power, right? So yeah, that's an interesting thing about power, right? Again, we look at all of the bad things within power, and there's obviously bad things with power because there's war, but there's never not been war, right?
And there is also as you correctly said, there is the power of speech, there's the power of intellect, and if we apply economic principles to that, we are compelled to discover our unique individual advantage. And so if, for example, if you are completely weak, let's say you are paralyzed, you cannot move, but yet you manage to become such a compelling writer that people...
Or one of the greatest scientists to ever exist.
Exactly.
Like, so these people are not weak.
Exactly.
Right? So just because, when we think about power, unfortunately, we do throw ourselves into this Spartan idea. If you cannot carry a shield, a high enough, a bronze 10-pound shield from shoulder to knee, then you therefore don't have power. And it's like, okay, well, that's not at all what that means. That is an extremely immature interpretation of that word. And it is simply trying to characterize the concept as one of brutality and domination. While at the same time, I find frameworks that don't consider the realist interpretation of things to be ones that miss the fact that there is brutality and domination in the world. And the way you address that is not through weakness, but through strength. It always has been. And so another critical realist framework, right? I don't know if you've heard this phrase before. It's kind of a weird phrase that only realists know, I think, but like the world is in a state of anarchy, right? That is a core realist belief. The world is in a state of anarchy, meaning nation states, there's nothing up here. There's no super government that's ordering nation states. Now we've got some regulations that are kind of going on, and there and these are interesting, right? We do have some international bodies, but how do these international bodies derive their power, or how have they derived their power since the Bretton Woods Agreement post World War II?
Well, by governments agreeing to it.
No, the U.S. Navy.
Okay,
that's it. Like that is the economic order, right there. The U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marines, and then the rest of the U.S. military if necessary. That is the thing that for global international free trade, right? The international order, or whatever the fuck that is. Yeah, okay, no, that is American military power that has substantiated that.
Yeah, wait. It's not that simple. For example, like the WTO has implemented a rules-based framework which countries voluntarily submit themselves to, and when there is a dispute, the WTO rules, and then states largely, not always, of course, but then they adhere. There's like in a conflict between in a trade conflict between Australia and the European Union, the American Navy doesn't play a part. I'm not saying that these international governing bodies are the be all and end all, but there are some structures that make it work, that have a certain level of power.
These international organizations were created at the end of World War II.
Come closer to the mic.
Yeah, sorry. These international organizations were created at the end of World War II and were substantiated on the basis of American power. They derive their authority from U.S. funds and from U.S. might. Now, they do have a larger interest now. Part of the challenge to the maintenance of these international institutions has been the fact that the United States is no longer the sole dominant power in the world. Again, this is realism. Right? The reason why this is happening is because of realism. It's not because we voted a certain way. It's because economies have shifted, military power has shifted, right? And could we have changed the scales? I don't know, but I doubt it. I don't think so. That's another kind of here's my favorite realist test. If you were to change the president of Denmark with the leader of Libya, what would happen? Nothing.
Yes.
There would be no change.
Yeah.
Okay. So the president of Denmark is largely doing things that are allowed within the power structure of everything to do with what the state of Denmark is. And as is the political leadership of Libya. It's not based upon the moral individual constitution and secret wishes of the leadership. So there's very little change from administration to administration within any nation state.
Let's get back quickly. Let's round up to Thucydides. What is the upshot? What do we learn from Thucydides?
Oh yeah, I know. I think I have totally left off on. I've already passed on from that. Thucydides were good. Power is a thing. Strong do what they can, weak suffer what they must. That's what's happening, and it's a call to strength.
Call to strength. Got it.
Sovereignty is predicated on strength. Period. Right? You might have some other things come to your aid. You might have some law. You might have some help. Right? It's also the reason why many small states group up and band together to unite, for example.
Yep.
Right? It's why alliances form. For the exact reason, because 5 weak states become one strong state. So, okay. Now we get into Hobbes. And Hobbes, we also have to think about the context in which Hobbes is writing. So he was writing in during the War of the Roses. Massive civil war within England. So he saw outside of his doorstep a war of all against all. So when he was describing the state of nature as a war of all against all, he wasn't like merely being a philosopher. He wasn't simply speculating and going back in time and imagining what the world was like. He was also witnessing what the world was like around him. And it was a war of all against all. It was an extremely bloody, brutal conflict. And so his conclusion that we need a powerful state structure to come in and prevent tyrannical predation from neighborhood to neighborhood was, not an unreasonable thing to say. But the main point that I love about Hobbes, right, is that he really does think through the idea of liberty and how liberty had been, very romanticized in this period as almost licentiousness and aggressive freedom in a way. And he didn't take that. He saw that there was sitting alongside liberty was something approximating responsibility and competence. So the one quote from the text says, "The liberty whereof there is so frequent and honorable mention in the histories and philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in the writings and discourses of those that from them have received all their learning in politics, is not the liberty of particular men, but the liberty of the commonwealth or the state, the liberty of the state, which is the same with that which every man then should have if there were no civil laws, nor commonwealth at all. And the effects of it also would be the same. For as among masterless men, there is perpetual war of every man against his neighbor, no inheritance to transmit to the son, nor to expect from the father, no propriety of goods or lands, no security, but a full and absolute liberty in every particular man. So in states and commonwealths, not dependent on one another, every commonwealth, not every man, has an absolute liberty to do what it shall judge. That is to say, what that man or assembly that representeth it shall judge, most conducing to their benefit." So that, I think we see that all the time. When we see a government, when we see a state structure fall, we see now liberty for every individual and chaos. We do really see a world where it's just like, wow, it is only the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And strong means men ages 18 to 35, and weak mean women and children and the elderly. Yeah. And it's like, well, that is terrible. How can we prevent that? Well, law and order substantiated by police with guns who are funded and supported by a government and a constitution. That'd be a good idea. That'd be a really, really good idea. Otherwise, if my neighbor were bigger than me and stronger than me, he could just come over and take all my stuff. And I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. I guess I'd have the option of either losing all of my property or dying and losing all my property.
Yeah.
Right. So when we look at power in society and we look at what a state does, we see, wait a minute, a state is obliged to administer a unique form of power and have a unique form of liberty. So in the realist tradition, one thing that people would describe this as is that a state is obliged to have a monopoly on violence. That the state is the only thing that is allowed to conduct violent activities legitimately, that no one else is allowed to legitimately engage in a violent activity, because that undermines the entire fabric of law and order right from that. And again, that's another brutal phrase. The word violence, people don't like to talk about violence, but that is what law and order is meant to protect, first and foremost. That's the foundation. And so, that's why when we look at some of the things that have happened in the US in the past few years, for example, there's been protests and riots, everything from across every major US city to what happened on January 6th. And I look at these as one and the same. The problem in these events, obviously depending on your politics, one is bad and one is good, but that's disappointing, of course. From a non-ideological or CNN-based perspective, all of these events are very bad because they were parties engaged in violence that was not being prevented effectively. And that is terror. That's what terror is. And so we just have ordinary citizens who can walk out of their homes and engage in violence against people, businesses, families, government institutions, like vehicles, right? Like that's absolutely terrifying, because then if you have to look over your shoulder for your own neighbor, you're in a state of absolute panic, and so that's the Hobbesian state of nature that he's so worried about. And I think it's a good thing to protect against. How does this apply to businesses? Oh my God, it's very simple. If you own a company, or if you're the CEO and your rules are not firm and clear and evenly applied, then you have chaos within your company. You have staff members who, are they going to engage in violence? Probably not. Okay, that's not the thing I'm necessarily worried about, in a business, but going to engage in applying their own standards of company operation, setting up their own systems that are not in accordance with systems that have been defined and secured, creating factions within businesses. So I see that direct applicability there of this desire sometimes for people to not be mean, apparently, and to be nice, and to put nice as the apex of your moral outlook on the world, that often and at times they inadvertently end up creating a system that is actually quite mean and brutal, and puts it in place where, like, for example, let's look at this, right? If you are not a strong, firm leader that tries to get everybody to sit at the table and tries to include the whole company in a conversation, then what you end up is with a company of only the loud, confident, assertive people whose voices are heard. And a business doesn't want that. This is, again, people talk about inclusivity, and it is an important concept within business. You actively want your entire team participating, both feeling included and generating their ideas within your company. Because if you're not getting the ideas from everyone in your company, you are minimizing the amount of impact that your business can have, minimizing the amount of innovation, minimizing the amount of problem-solving skills at the table. And that happens all the time in a company, where if you don't allow that space and keep that space secure and protected for a meeting, for problem solving or something like that, you end up being very exclusive. And then the only people that come forward are people like me, who are loud and perhaps too confident sometimes, right? And that's not good, right? You want everybody's ideas to come forward within a company. You want everybody to feel safe to be able to bring those things forward. So yeah, I'm sorry. That's just an example there. I don't know how you feel about that one, but
absolutely. But there's also, of course, so there you displayed the kind of the inclusivity aspect of it. What I think is also important then, that there's a kind of a hierarchy of validity of what people are bringing to the table. That for this, I would refer to Ray Dalio's book Principles, where he outlines that not every voice that is being heard is of equal weight, of course, and the clear distinction between them is believability.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's context, right? I'm just talking about the situation of a company-wide meeting, like that, or the team meeting, right? And again, that's a thing that's happening every day in every business. Okay. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. The person with, yes, we have authority, we have hierarchy, we have higher levels of expertise. Absolutely. Right. But again, that's just one example. I'm not trying to put that above anything else. I'm just trying to highlight that as one example of a corporate activity that we engage in.
Okay. One more point on this topic of, obviously, of the Hobbesian concept of the state is the only actor who has the legitimate right to violence and to enforce its will. With Hobbes, of course, when you read it, what you realize is that there is no limiting principle. There is essentially what the state deems to be appropriate is its prerogative. There is no limiting principle, and if the state decides that there's going to be one state religion, then that's what's going to happen, right? And so there is nothing that would indicate to you that the state has gone off the rails. And when we look at especially the history of the 20th century, it is actually the state that has led to the biggest bloodshed, right? It's not the war of everyone against everyone. It is state implemented top-down terror. And so that would suggest that the Hobbesian narrative, suggesting that the worst that can happen is a war of everyone against everyone, is somehow at least made doubtful. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, the thing that's interesting about these state top-down conflicts, they seem to have a lot of voluntary and eager participation from everyone. So that's,
or at least from a vocal enough minority that is able to tip a state that started out well into a tyranny. You don't even need a majority. By far, you don't need everyone.
Yeah.
It's just enough if 10-20% of people are supporting a murderous terror regime, and everybody else is intimidated into silence. Then that's what happens with.
Well, yeah, okay. Again, we don't disagree that that's a bad thing. Okay, that's obviously a bad thing.
Yeah.
The question is you are resting the entire blame upon a state power structure. There is what it feels like, and that's where I just don't see that leap.
Well, my question is, if the way you presented it somehow suggests that in order to maintain law and order, the state, at least as far as Hobbes is concerned, can implement sometimes even brutal measures to maintain that law and order.
But the state will.
The state
and
will.
should, because to also quote Machiavelli, if you allow violence and criminality of one person within your state, if you show justice and mercy to them, you end up offending thousands.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're willing to engage in brutality to the unjust and the unmerciful, and if you're willing to be brutal, to the offending party, you end up saving millions or thousands.
Yeah.
So yes, no, there isn't a limiting principle. Is there poor enforcement? Absolutely. Is there perfect execution? Never. Right. So we're always going to have, again, imperfect execution. We're going to have ineffective administrators. We're going to have people who are in power who are not appropriate or wise. But again, there's been peaceful, productive nation states with morons and brutes as emperors, just as there have been philosopher kings who have led their state into ruin, tyranny, and chaos. So that's, but on what you're saying, it is a perfect segue right into Alexander Hamilton, particularly Federalist number 10. So, okay, this idea of there being no limiting principle. Well, it's like, of course there's a limiting principle. It's called factions within a society. So factions will always exist in society. And the point of a good state, the point of a good power structure, and the point of good culture is to not limit the growth of factions, as they are inevitable and guaranteed, but it is to limit their power effectively, to make it so they do not have absolute power, right? So this is why, is there a limiting principle in law? Well, no, of course there's not. Is there a limiting principle in natural law, though? Probably, right? And this is what Alexander Hamilton is talking about when he's talking about factions within Federalist number 10. He said, quote, there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction, the one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction, the one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. The interference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. I think that's a perfect quote. I agree with that completely. Obviously, if we were to eliminate, individual liberty of opinion, of association, of conscience, we'd be in the worst possible tyranny that we can imagine, right? And so, well, if we allow for that individual freedom, both within people, within families, within companies, within cities, and all of that, we are inevitably going to give rise to factions. People disagreeing, even disagreeing vehemently. And we can look at this politically. We can look at this within a business. I deal with this all the time with a lot of my clients, where there's arguments, and sometimes people get frustrated, and I'll say, listen, this is a good thing. We're having a aggressive disagreement about the future of the company and about how to go about it. And we have people with different perspectives who have the authority and the experience and the know-how on how to grow this business. And they're fighting vigorously for what they calculate to be correct. We don't want to limit that faction. We simply want to prevent it from derailing productivity. So we want the debate to take place. We want even the vigorous argument to take place. But we don't want the vigorous argument to result in a revolution or civil war or the domination of the 51%.
Yes, what I see, again, and by the way, when I bring up counter arguments, it doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with them, but I just think, what could one say against that? Is that the problem is that very often what constitutes healthy, vigorous debate is very, very subjective, right? Many people would simply, by discussing a very controversial topic briefly and just allowing the people who are on one side to just voice their opinions publicly, and then, like, let's say in one company meeting, in an all hands meeting, right, whether the company should be sold or not, and one faction is very much against that, and the other one is exactly for it, right? And then you just have one instance of a debate, and then that's it, and more points could be brought up. What is the right balance? When do you, I know it's difficult to say in abstract, but I just feel that the inherent problem in this is that there is no clear delineation of what constitutes healthy debate, and at what point is it paralysis? And when is healthy debate worth stopping in order to move forward? When do you have to overrule, and so that the Hamiltonian effect can come to pass?
Yeah, well, eventually a leader has to make a decision. So from the Cyropedia, diversity in council, unity in command. So, I mean, that's got to come into play eventually, right? And yeah, we can't be engaged in endless debate. But even that, I would say what you're describing is an effect of debate, gridlock, paralysis. Like, we want to control for that effect too. We want to control for the extremes, which is too fast of a wind of change or decision-making, and stasis. Edmund Burke, who I'm about to talk about, he didn't say this, but there's a great poem by William Butler Yeats, where he's talking about a lot of the Irish Whig philosophers, and he's talking about Berkeley, and he's talking about Burke, and he summarized Burke's philosophy brilliantly. This is why I love poets and artists sometimes too, because they understand things where it's just like, damn it, they figured it out better than anyone else. Like Burke wrote 1 billion words, and then Yeats wrote one sentence, and summarizing his billion words. And Yeats said that Burke proved that the state was like a tree, which is to say, it is something that must grow, but slowly. And yeah, that's pretty nice, right? And the tree is a beautiful image too, right? It invokes natural law. It also invokes something very old that can live for a very long time. And if you want something to be very old and work for a very long time and do very well, 1, it needs to grow. 2, it needs to grow big. Imagine a small tree. What the fuck is a small tree? What does it do for anybody? It can't provide shade. It can't grow fruit. It can't be a home for animals. It can barely clean the air. You know what I mean? But like a big tree, okay, well, man, a big tree can do a lot of things for a lot of people, right? So
sounds like a state that's interfering in more and more affairs of the people, like a state that is growing to regulate many areas of life that previously it didn't. That's like an
No,
argument for statism, right?
I would see it as capacity. Like it's got to grow, but it's got to grow slowly, and it ought. Well, should it not grow? Do you not want your state to become more capable, or your society in general, or the world around you to be more productive, to be more efficient, to have more wealth, to provide greater prosperity, to have more opportunities for more people, to be a home to more people?
I want the state to limit itself. And in
Okay.
that, I'm a classical, I don't know what you would call it in the American tradition, but probably a Republican, where you would say that I want the state to be as limited to the most necessary functions that it has.
Sure. Okay. Well,
get out of the way.
Again, but you're putting certain leaves on the tree that I'm not putting on there. Like a state. So one thing that, again, even a Republican in America, that they want a strong, powerful state that's able to protect its borders, defend against invasion, provide for the common good, enforce law and order. So like whether we write in how much funding, I'm not making a comment about what the education funding is, for example. Okay. So, but we're getting slightly off track, and you keep trying to politicize me in ways that I don't want to.
No. I don't. No, not at all politicized. But the thing is, the state is a tree that needs to grow. I would rather like to put it as, and maybe didn't Burke phrase it as the Commonwealth, which the way these writers tend to see Commonwealth is not just a state; it's more like society and society's capabilities. And that's, of course, I agree with that.
Okay.
Right.
But actually, and actually, that's when I say state, that's more what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean the whole fabric of the nation.
Fabric of the nation. There we go.
Yeah, yes. That would be. I'm more accustomed to using the word state, but yeah. But yeah, if I were to regard great realist philosophers in general, when they are using the word state or commonwealth or something like that, yes, that's precisely what they're talking about. When they, on the one hand, when they're talking about the power dynamics of that, they're vesting power within the traditional legitimate representatives or monarchs or what have you, right? But when they're talking about the whole of society, or most of their commentary on the state or the Commonwealth or whatever, right? They are talking about the whole of society, the whole of the people. Yeah. And that's not easily, but again, because that's not easily divided. That's the point, right? Like again, Denmark, Libya, whoosh, no change. Why? Because of the state, the whole of society.
Yeah, the state, as in, if you use the word state as in the state of affairs, right? How everything is, because
the state of things.
the situation in Libya is due to history, traditions, society, whether the society has had a certain, has gone through certain stages that others haven't, and so on, right? So I think it's a definitional problem, right? When we say state, but okay, let's continue with Burke. You were there.
Okay. Yeah. And so now we're going to Burke, and this is where this is where I kind of conclude. And I think you'll see how I've hopefully at least, wrapped up what I'm calling my foundations of realism: Thucydides, Hobbes, Hamilton's Federalist 10, and then Burke. So Burke wrote Reflections on the Revolution of France. He wrote a lot of things, but I love Edmund Burke. One thing, just as a commentary on all the people I've talked about here, but maybe especially Burke so far, the thing that's brutal sometimes about reading people like this is you realize how just unintelligent you are.
Yeah.
I mean, again, Burke would fit more in a paragraph than there's more political meaning in a paragraph of Burke, just pull any one, than I think any statement I've ever heard from any American politician in my lifetime. The whole corpus of their work, like it's
And for context, we have to say Burke was a politician. He wasn't some
Oh yeah, he was.
He wasn't
was a
a
politician.
airy-fairy philosopher in his ivory tower. He was a man of the real world with obligations as a lawmaker.
Yes. He was a member of parliament. So anyway, in his reflections on the revolution in France, I call Burke the greatest pen pal ever, because he was initially, someone had written him a letter saying, hey, I'd like your thoughts on what's going on in France. And he wrote a letter back and didn't send it yet. And then things had escalated within France. And then he wrote more to the letter, and then he wrote more. And then he realized, like, okay, this is no longer a letter. I now have to write a book. But he kept writing it in letter format. Because he had started it as a letter, and he even says that you can read that in the text. He's just like, well, basically I started this as a letter. Fuck it. I'm just going to keep writing it like a letter, but I have a lot to say on the subject because things have really escalated in France. Anyway, he did not like the revolution in France. He did not see it as a victory of liberty. He saw it as a victory of tyranny, ultimately. Anyway, where this is all leading, again, because you're pushing back against the strength and against the limiting principle and things like that, where it's just like, wait a minute, when the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, ends up right where Burke is on, if you have a weak state, everything collapses. You have the worst possible society, right? So if we are ultimately going to be in the binary of strength and weakness, which inevitably we are going to fall, even though there's a lot of gradation in there. But if we're going to be leaning one way in what we should be doing with our lives, in our businesses, in society, we should lean towards strength, because weakness is the greatest possible vice. And Burke says, we are next to see how they have conducted themselves in contriving equal impositions, proportioned to the means of the citizens, and the least likely to lean heavy on the active capital employed in the generation of that private wealth from whence the public fortune must be derived. By suffering the several districts and several of the individuals in each district to judge what part of the old revenue they might withhold, instead of better principles of equality. So the people were devising up how they would tax each other in the new system, right? So instead of better principles of equality, a new inequality was introduced of the most oppressive kind. Payments were regulated by dispositions, a tax on your moral fortitude, to the state, of course, to the ideology. The parts of the kingdom which were the most submissive, the most orderly, or the most affectionate to the commonwealth, bore the whole burden of the state. Nothing turns out to be so oppressive and unjust as a feeble government, a tax by which luxury, avarice, and selfishness were screened, and the load thrown upon productive capital, upon integrity, generosity, and public spirit, a tax of regulation upon virtue. At length the mask is thrown off, and they are now trying means, with little success, of exacting their benevolence by force. So that was his view on the French Revolution. And what happened? They got a dictatorship soon after that. So it plunged the state into chaos. It was a war of every man against every man. They simply just threw out the old order because it was bad, and they replaced it with an even worse one. And it resulted in, the strong doing what they can and the weak suffering what they must. And the strong were the people with the guns and no morals. And the weak were the people who had some vision of morality, and were women and children and the elderly and the poor, and it's just like, that's a society characterized by predation, not by strength, and so weakness in government, the result is all you get is barbarians who run the state. So morality and strength are obligatory components. And so if you have a moral view of the world, you have to be a realist. Otherwise, you're just a poet.
Fascinating stuff. And what I just thought about is, have you read 1984?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Orwell's state, it is, of course, a very effective government that is so strong that is such a strong state, such a powerful state that is so all-consuming that, of course, it could be regarded as the ultimate Leviathan, right? And so when you said that it is necessary that morality and power both are required to govern well, that of course applies to both state building as well as business, that this is then of course that the morality box is not ticked in the Orwellian state, and this is the difference.
And well, one, that's fictional. But two, it's describing something approximating the Soviet Union, and that collapsed in a generation. So part of what we have to examine as truth is something consistent with the term longevity, right? So if we see something existing for a short period of time, and then collapsing in on itself, it's not unreasonable to conclude that something within it, if not the whole fabric of its philosophy and constitution, are poisonous and discordant with natural law. So there has to be power within a state for it to be effective, and there has to be a moral opus of welfare for the people within it. Otherwise, it presents itself as just a powerful tyranny. Right? So when we look at power again, there is a tyrant and there is a benevolent ruler. So benevolence comes from power. And now in this sense, like, again, I'm being overly Western on all of this. I could have just talked about all the works of Confucius, because that's all of Eastern philosophy. So we have a much more diverse set of political philosophies within the Western tradition. But if we were to look at the entire, like everything from Lao Tzu, everything from Confucius, if we were to look at the history of the three kingdoms, which I'm absolutely in love with, and we combine two of my favorite rulers of all time, I think the greatest ruler to exist is the combination of Cao Cao and Liu Bei, mainly as described within the narrative histories of the Three Kingdoms period of China. But Cao Cao was the cunning, hyper Machiavellian military strategist, and Liu Bei was the man of the people, moral statesman who believed in loyalty and conscience and ethic. And when reading about the Three Kingdoms period and when seeing the television program, it's like 89 episodes, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, put together. When I see that, it's just like, oh man, like they're really portraying as like this dichotomy of leadership, but I don't see it as one versus the other. I see it as, wait a minute, take this set of virtue and that set of virtue. And virtue is a great word. And that brings us into Machiavelli. So Machiavelli would use the word virtue all the time, but the word virtue or virtu in Italian has a slightly different meaning than how we would mean it in English in the 21st century. When we're talking about virtues in the 21st century, we picture what? Like, a nun, right? Saintliness, something like that. Kindness, generosity, in that regard. But virtue in Machiavelli's time and in his meaning was the combination of strength and capability and insight and strategy with a aim for positive means and outcomes. But it heavily did rely upon capacity, upon individual ability, upon knowledge, upon talent. And that is, I think, the core of realism and the core of Machiavelli's philosophy. When we're looking at good, we must be talking about what we can do. We must be talking about what we can accomplish, what we can meaningfully put forward, what we can actually build, what we can actually put in society, what we have the capacity to create. That these things must be linked. And if anything, our focus should not be on our moral well-wishing, but on our capacity development. And well, Jordan Peterson talks about this extensively. Wait a minute, good people aren't nice, they're monsters who are capable of lifting a society up on their shoulders. Because there are people in the world that need help.
Yeah,
even the strong need help often, right? So
I think that is the thing that so many people get wrong, is harmlessness is not a virtue, and is very often being portrayed as such. Whereas instead it's those who have swords but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. It's not the meek and mild who will inherit the world. It's those who have the power but control it by applying a good moral framework. This is the thing to pursue, because the world can be a dark place, and maybe this is a good place to transition into.
It's not that the world can be a dark, like can is too soft. Darkness is endogenous to the world. Death, wickedness, theft, lies, malicious intent. You will encounter that. It's guaranteed to happen. People who try to take advantage of you, people who try to steal, people who try to win power through corrupt means, people who try to dominate through strength alone and nothing else, people who oppress. That is part of the world. It's never not been a part of society. If we don't have a set of tools or a language to address it, we're just gonna be shocked. We're gonna walk out into the world where bad things are endogenous to it, and we're going to be incapable of dealing with it. And this is the perfect. I think we talked about this in the last episode, right? This is exactly what businesses deal with. Again, let no one think that we're dealing with assured and safe outcomes, but rather unknown and dangerous outcomes. We do not know what the future is going to be. Businesses are dealing with firing people. They're dealing with theft. They're dealing with espionage sometimes. They're dealing with misuse of systems. They're dealing with competition, regulation that's crushing them. Like, there's no business in the world that doesn't have at least another handful of companies that are trying to put them out of business. So it's a war. Straight up. It's from the beginning. Business is a conflict.
Okay, but when I said the world can be a dark place, and you interrupted and saying that no, it is a very dark place. The issue is that for many people who live, especially in the West, who have only largely experienced peacetime, and if there was a war, then it was in some faraway country, definitely not at home.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to, it's a bit of a cliche that we've gone soft, but I think it's simply a diagnosis of where we are as a society, that not many people have actually encountered malice. Not many people have been, or many people have never experienced, for example, violence against themselves, right? I have, the worst thing that ever happened to me was that my student housing was burglarized, right? That's the biggest crime that was ever perpetrated against me. And it was not even against me. It was just that there was a room that was available to be to be stolen from. So all I'm saying is that this is so endemic, I think, for so many people, that they have not really experienced very many bad things in their life. And that's why, and this is where I'm going into like a very specific application of realism. I wonder what you think about that. I sometimes encounter solopreneurs who tell me, when I ask them, so is your main goal revenue and profit maximization? They say, no, it's not. And for me, and this is kind of where I'm not an idealist, 100% idealist at heart. This is where my realist comes out, and I'm thinking, why the hell not?
Yeah.
Are you already like loaded, filthy rich? And no, these people very often are sort of getting by only, but their main goal is not profit maximization. It is simply to be useful, to have fun while they're working, to have the feeling that they're adding value. And I'm always telling them, isn't you making a lot of money one of the best reflections of how much value you're adding into the world? If 10
Yeah.
people pay you 10,000, isn't that a sign that you are adding more value than if 7 people say you 700?
Mm.
Isn't that a clear indication? And people don't seem to, very often I see people not making that final conclusion because they've associated profit making as, of course, is something evil. And this is the area I feel where I'm struggling the most with, not with trying to shake people out of their complacency, echoes of which we've seen in the conversation with our prospect, which we've seen, because I'm thinking they are being complacent by not looking at the world as it is. In the end, my trying to convince our prospect into applying these principles of demand gen that I was talking about was partially an expression of realism. Because I'm telling them the stuff that you're doing, cold calling, this kind of fake like ebook downloading and then pretending that these people, scoring them on some arbitrary scale, implying that these people have more buying intent than others, you know that this is not working. So look at the world as it is and investigate the principles of demand gen, because this is where the world is going. And so that was for me, when we were in preparation to this conversation, my main kind of realization of where I apply realism. And this is where realism and idealism sort of melds. If you've seen, if you believe that you have seen adumbrations of the future, and you at least allocate a little bit of capital into this stream of client acquisition methods, just to be prepared. Don't bet the house on it.
Sure.
Don't bet the company on it. But me trying to insist that they should investigate demand gen is an application of realism.
No, that's a very appropriate strategy. Yeah.
Right. And so would you also have the same reaction when you hear like a solopreneur or coach, consultant, or whatever telling you that their main goal is not profit maximization? What's your reaction to that?
The majority of people say that their main goal is not profit maximization, likely because either it's a true fact or at least a self-belief that they can't make very much money. And so they protect their weaknesses by covering themselves in a statement of moral virtue, apparent moral virtue. Oh, I'm a good person. I'm not trying to make a lot of money. I'm a good person. That's what they're trying to say, right? I'm not greedy, is what they think they're saying. But again, again, to go back to the realist phrase, how much power do you want? I don't know. Who am I fighting 10 years from now, right? How much profit do you want? Well, I don't know. What's the state of the economy 10 years from now?
Yeah.
What taxes are in place? How's my country, my neighborhood doing? Is there a global pandemic that's shutting down half of the businesses? Do we have any of those answers? Has the housing market collapsed, or has it boomed? Has the stock market collapsed, or has it boomed? Has there been a change in policy based upon XYZ? Is China now in charge of the global economy? I don't know any of that. Yeah. Neither do you.
How about as much profit as possible?
So how about we try to get as much profit as possible? Yeah,
exactly.
So, and then again, that then gets interpreted in this lazy way. Oh, so you mean like be extremely cutthroat and screw everybody over? It's like, okay, well, that's going to work for like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Good strategy. Right. So, it's a, long-term developmental growth and profit making, while at the same time trying to do everything you can to grow as quickly as possible is, well, why wouldn't you do that? Like that's,
yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, again, they're not, I don't think they're, I read a funny article. So teachers don't believe people should make money. Right. And they think that if you make money, you should be taxed like crazy. Well, during the pandemic, obviously a lot of schools at every level were shut down. Yeah. So some teachers had to teach online. a few of those teachers, and I mean a very small percentage of those teachers, ended up creating online classes. And some of them were very good at it and sold them and made a lot of money. Those teachers have different views on tax policy today.
Of course. Yeah, what a surprise. Yeah.
So I like that. But Machiavelli, ready? All right. So here you go. I'm going to crush you with this one. I told you I had a secret strategy that I wasn't going to let you know about. So when one big reason why I like Machiavelli, other than his ideas, which I think are brilliant, I think he nailed it across the board. Again, you want to talk, at least in my opinion, if you want to talk about a person where when you read him, you realize how unintelligent you are. Read like it just, you're getting hammered with every line. But one thing that I found about Machiavelli to just be incredible, especially given the reputation that's been put upon him. You know, his name is literally synonymous with the devil, right? I mean, wow, what a bad guy, right? When I actually started to understand the actual man he was, the person, and insofar as we can know people from, 400, 500, 600 years ago, I don't know, but of the evidence that we have, I find it very compelling. So again, he was a diplomat for a long time. He was chancellor, secretary of the state of Florence for well over a decade. So he was a man of extremely high position, relatively speaking. He was an aristocrat. Now, eventually he got exiled. He was imprisoned and tortured for a bit and then exiled by the Medici family. Reason for his exile was because he was so vocal in his support for the representative Republican government rather than the effective dictatorship of the Medicis. Again, something that people easily forget, right? Now, during his exile, that was when he wrote The Prince. And one thing that he would do every day, and he wrote letters about this too, is so he would spend time in his study, in his home. By the way, he because he was an aristocrat, he was allowed to choose where he was exiled. He had the option of living in the incredible mansion designed by Michelangelo, where his cardinal uncle lived. So his uncle was a cardinal to Rome and lived in a mansion designed by Michelangelo. So what's that? Like the greatest place on earth to live? Probably something like that. No, he didn't choose to live there. He chose to live in a little farmhouse in San Casciano outside of Florence, where he could devote himself to study and writing. And there was a secret passageway between his home and a tavern where the common people, the travelers, the farmers, the butchers would go every night and drink and be raucous and stuff like that. The tavern was also called L'Albergaccio. I think that's how it's pronounced, which literally translates to the bad inn. Just perfect. Perfect brand for Machiavelli. He would go there every night to be with the common people, and that's where he wrote The Prince. And he wrote about the people there, lovingly, even though he was in a very different position in life. And when I see our leaders in the world today, when I see our intellectuals and our academics in the world today, I don't see people who go roll in the mud with everyone else, who don't maintain their connection with the world in that way. And that is just, I think, such a true statement about the character of Machiavelli that is just sits so in juxtaposition to so many of the people we see in power today. And it specifically reminds me of a very great stanza from a poem that you know. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, and walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither friend nor foe can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much. I think that stanza is about the heights of where a man can be in terms of their internal constitution, their own morality, their own psychological strength. That's it. You got it. Like, you are psychologically strong if you can do that. And that I see in Machiavelli completely. I see the ordinary human, that maintained that spoke with crowds and with common people and kept his virtue, that didn't stand above them, that walked literally with kings and never lost the common touch. That that was harmed by friends and foes, but still wrote some of the most incredible, influential masterpieces that any human being has ever created. So, yeah, that's the person.
Yeah, I think I'm not surprised, because everything that I so far have read by Machiavelli and about him did not contradict that in any way. What I sometimes wonder as I read his writings is how exactly, where is the limiting principle elaborated upon? Like, where is the limit of it, right? I keep not finding a good answer for how could not the worst, the Stalins, the Hitlers of the world, but where would the Putins and the Lukashenkos disagree with Machiavelli, or where could they use him for their own means? And I very often find that, they would be able to subscribe to it. But no, I of course 100% agree with the need to embrace this kind of duality, where you both, of course, you are talking to the crowds, and at the same time you're able to operate at the highest level. It's similarly, you have to exercise power, and that goes very much in what you said. It's both things. You have to be able to exercise power while at the same time also having a very strong moral core. You have to it's the yin and yang principle. This kind of duality is absolutely necessary. Similarly, like we said before, those who have the swords but have to keep them sheathed. It's the ability to exercise power and letting others know that you can exercise that power so that you never have to. And that is ultimately what makes for a good life. Both yourself as an individual, where you are expanding yourself in your abilities, in your circle of influence. This is what life is all about. We have to expand in where we are. And this means, and this is one of the pet peeves, that's why I brought it up. It's people who say, no, I don't want to make a lot of money. I don't need to make a lot of money. I'm not saying it's the most important thing, but how limiting are you? How much do you limit yourself by placing these restrictions on you? It is difficult to make money. And that's why you are, it's an anti-realist principle, or it's an anti-realist action or thought or approach to the world. If you tell yourself that, oh no, it's like, no, profit maximization is not my goal.
It's easy to convince ourselves that that difficult things are undesirable.
Yes. And similarly, exactly according to this, I see the refusal of prospects, of executives that I speak to, when they insist, like our prospects who we spoke to, when they insist on the old ways of doing the work. I'm not saying that everybody needs to embrace every single fad. It's not. But if you are not really willing to look at what's happening, and you always put it away as, no, this is not for us, but it's the other industry where it's working. And if it's our industry, well, they have it in their company DNA. They can do this kind of demand gen thing. We are not set up for this, and all of that. Those are all anti-realist thought patterns that ultimately at some point will lead to a decay of the state. In this case, the business.
Yeah.
So precisely. I think sorry, go ahead.
No, precisely. I just talked about this literally yesterday with one of my clients, where they have a leadership structure and a management team right now, and a system of decision-making there's so many checks and balances where they can't make any change. They can't make any reforms. And so I told them the story of Sparta and their constitution. Sparta had so many checks and balances and so much of a commitment to the way things were, and where no one could reform anything. And the only thing that happened to the Spartan state was it just collapsed over 600 years.
Yeah.
And by the time the Romans got there, they saw a bunch of weirdos adhering to archaic customs that had gotten them nowhere. But for only a generation.
Yeah.
So.
And that's why we have to get back to Burke ultimately, because it is so difficult to tell. This is ultimately the art of living well. It's so difficult to tell what needs to be changed. Sometimes a necessary change turns out to have been an aberration, a place where you should not have gone. And therefore, I have to of course, have to agree with Burke, where he says everything needs to be done with extreme caution. Every change that you engage in needs to be done with caution, but at the same time, it needs to be done. It needs to be at least tested.
Sure.
And thankfully, as we are standing on the shoulders of more and more giants, we can actually put somebody like Eric Ries on the shoulders of Burke.
Yeah.
We say he gave us a framework to try something out, to do a minimum viable product, to develop minimum viable skills, as you outline in your great book that I do want to mention again here, Don't Chase the Dream Job, Build It. Everybody should buy it. Developing these minimum viable skills, you now have Eric Ries standing on the shoulders of Edmund Burke. Proceed with caution.
Yeah.
But at the same time, do experiment with new things. Do it in a way that it does not take a huge amount of resources. If you as a company, at least you see how demand gen is changing the world of B2B marketing, and you are not willing to close your eyes, dedicate half a full-time employee of their time to allow them to explore this going forward. It's not such a huge investment, and you need to be able to get ready to it. Chris Walker once recently he's a demand gen guru. He said that a company like GE, for example, in the spirit of realism, should have 2 people who only work on TikTok, of all things. GE, giant conglomerate. And he says a company like this should have 2 people all day and every day focusing only on figuring out how TikTok works.
Yeah.
It's their investment into an unknown future. It's not a lot. They're not betting the company on marketing on TikTok. But this is a realist principle.
Well, and yeah, I agree with that. And I think here I've got just a series of statements of Machiavelli that I see have direct business translation. And it relates to what you're talking about right now, that I wanted to just bring up here. And this is kind of my is ought dimension, right? The is always greater than ought. And effectively, what you're saying is like, hey, there are these new ises of how people are succeeding in marketing. If a business is not willing to speculate a little bit with those new things, if they remain, we ought do what has worked, right? And don't properly engage in effective and reasonable innovation, then they're going to be left behind. And what Machiavelli says is, and speaking to the reason why he wrote The Prince in general, he said, "But it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his own professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil." And that's exactly what I think you're talking about. It's what we see within companies that don't engage in ineffective, innovative activities, or who innovate too quickly, right? But they're effectively talking about their own preferences of operation.
Yes.
This is the founder's dilemma too, right? People who found companies or who are initially there are typically the worst people in the world to run that company, because they're so baked in with everything they did to get it from 0 to 1. And they're just like, okay, well, I got from 0 to 1. So that means from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 10 is all going to be the same sets of ideas. And it's like, well, no, Not at all.
Oh.
The world's changing. The economy is constantly changing. New technologies are coming out. The system has to be refreshed to an appropriate degree. So that is, in a sense, the is. And the ought becomes the old edifice of ideas that are romanticized and are fixed and never changing. Again, that kind of balances it. There's obviously the other ought of like, here's the guaranteed future. It's like, well, no, that's not true, right? And then the opposite ought would be then saying, we can keep doing the same things over and over again, and it's always going to work the same way. That's also not true. Like, especially in business, right? Okay, boom, you start a company, you do a thing, you find an innovative way to go about. Let's just take TikTok, for example, right? A company succeeds by marketing on TikTok. They're the first ones. Congratulations, right? They're the 1 in a million, right? 999,000 people lost money by trying to figure out TikTok first. One company figured it out. Great. You're geniuses or you're lucky, probably lucky. Okay. Yeah. Well, guess what happens within like 30 seconds? Like a dozen people have now dissected everything you've done to be successful. And then they sell a coaching course on how to succeed on TikTok. And now there's what? How many social media coaches are out there right now?
I think
5 billion?
I think in the billions.
No, not influencers, coaches, people who train people how to market on social media.
Yeah.
It's the most conservative job in the world.
Mm.
Like it is a historic. It's almost a dinosaur at this point.
Yeah.
Right. Like, okay, well, like things are changing, and now everybody's on social media. I mean, even like I see with people talking about certain things within email marketing, and it's almost like cliche. Like I saw this one guy sent me an email, and like it had my name on it, and it's just like, okay, great. You have an email marketing program. Mm-hmm. Everybody has an email marketing program. That's not personal.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but
it's an arms race, right?
It's an arms race. Yeah. And so you got to move, you got to keep moving.
Exactly. And these things work. I've had somebody send me, I was dabbling with it myself. Somebody sent me a video where you see the animation in the background doing like he's actually scrolling through my profile. It was like a thumbnail of a video where he was scrolling through my profile. So obviously you click on that, and he gets like 20% click-through rates on these completely cold emails. So it is an arms race. And yes, you need to invest in these things, not in all of them, but kind of strategically think. That's where you have to apply some strategic thinking and see, okay, what is actually likely to work. And then also because demand gen is such a fascinating topic because it is so principles based. It is so first principles based because it demands of you that you offer real value. Anybody who looks at a corporate ebook that people can download in exchange for their email address and all their company data, when you actually read those kind of ebooks, you never get real insight.
Oh my God, yeah.
They're awful. The vast majority of them. I've never read an ebook that ever got any value out of it.
Yeah.
But if a company actually manages to pull off a good podcast, like I'm telling you, this conversation of ours, it's long, it's complicated, it is deep, but this kind of stuff, we have listeners, we have comments, people are engaging with us, and this is only the beginning. And we are talking about a topic that is not immediately useful. It's a foundational topic. But this kind of stuff where you add real value to people, where you educate, you even entertain, this is intellectual entertainment, I consider it. This kind of stuff is, if you look at it from first principles, the stuff that will get brand affinity. It builds brand affinity with you as a personal brand, with your business. And that's the beauty of demand gen, that it goes to these kind of first principles. It's not a hack, it's not a tactic. It is really something that builds long-term affinity. I recently got a message from someone telling me, I've been following you for a year. I'm ready to have a call now, right? This guy's been following me for year, and I've never saw his name before. I've never seen his name before. So just goes to show, I don't know how I ended up here, but
Yeah.
key point being that by applying strategic thinking, you need to see which possible avenues of go-to-market could be applicable to you, and if they seem like aligned to first principles, then you want to build affinity, just go for it and invest in it. Not everything, don't bet the whole house, but there needs to be some kind of budget allocated to that. And this is not an idealist demand. This is not an idealist imperative. It is a very, very hardcore realist one.
It's a core investment strategy on how to affect appropriate, cautious change over time. I have another great one for you. I picked this out for you in particular. I think it would work, that you could use this to great effect with your coaching business and with the people you with the people as well that you help, right? To be useful to them and to you, right? And my summary of this is that powerful choices are more successful than weak choices, right? And Machiavelli says, thus it will always happen that when he who is not your friend will demand your neutrality, whilst he who is your friend will entreat you to declare yourself with arms. And irresolute princes, to avoid present dangers, generally follow the neutral path and are generally ruined. But when a prince declares himself gallantly in favor of one side, if the party with whom he allies himself conquers, although the victor may be powerful and may have him at his mercy, yet he is indebted to him, and there is established a bond of amity, and men are never so shameless as to become a monument of ingratitude by oppressing you. Victories, after all, are never so complete that the victor must not show some regard, especially to justice. But if he with whom you ally yourself loses, you may be sheltered by him, and whilst he is able, he may aid you, and you become companions on a fortune that may rise again. So that's more of obviously a direct commentary on the strategy of, appropriate alliances. But where I see that in business is this commentary on neutrality and clear, decisive choices. We could also say niching yourself appropriately, but fortune favors the bold, and so if you're going out there, especially as a solopreneur or a business of any level, and it's just like, we are pursuing the path of neutrality and in our marketing, in our communication, in our product offering, in our service offering. It's like, that's just weakness. That's just weakness. You're not distinguishing yourself. And so so if you're characterized by that fear, or if you're irresolute, right? Machiavelli's word there is irresolute, which I think is a brilliant word, right? An irresolute decision maker, whether you're an owner, a CEO, or a solopreneur, good luck. Good luck. Make a decisive bad decision and then fix it a week later. My God, but make a decision. Be decisive about what you're doing. Be clear and go for it, right? Go all the way with what your service, with what your product offering is. Because if your goal is neutrality within business, well, you're just going to decline.
Yeah.
You're going to be outcompeted by everybody else, innovating, offering something that's more exciting in a more exciting way. And obviously I'm sure you see this all the time with people that you probably work with who are trying to figure out exactly what it is that they're doing, maybe, and are worried to put themselves out there and are worried to really make a clear statement about, I do this, I don't do that. And it's just like, okay, well, if you're going to pursue the path of neutrality about yourself, then you're not really going to find your clientele.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if that's completely applies, but where I see the biggest resistance is in people are so afraid of getting rejected, especially when they are already more senior, older, experienced, that this seems almost like beneath them. And I feel that it could apply in this context as well, because after all, if you don't open yourself up to failure and like quantifiable failure, I pitched this product 50 times and it got rejected. If you don't do that, you can delude yourself for the long run that you are sort of succeeding. You get a client here or there, so you get the referral here and there, but when you try to pitch it to strangers, it doesn't work. You never succeed. Then it tells you something about your product. And that's what I like about this quote, is that You need to ally yourself with something, with a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Take that product and then market the hell out of it. Do the most you can to make as much money with it as possible. And because if you cannot, if that product is not good, at least you've learned something, that this style of doing business doesn't fit you. Maybe another one does. But that's why I have such a visceral gut reaction to people who are these coasting solopreneurs, right? These kind of businesses, sort of, we get the occasional referral and so on, and they just get by. That's just not a way to live.
Yeah.
Neither from a personal standpoint nor from a business standpoint. So I very much resonate with the quote, powerful choices result in success eventually. It can take some time. Yeah.
Well, it will, and the other thing as well, and this is where there's another person I think about who no one would describe as a realist, but when I listen to, his philosophy, I'm just like, man, that's so similar to Machiavelli, but Alan Watts. No, he's not a realist, right? But Alan Watts, brilliant guy. One thing he talks about in this regard, and again, it's more of a dreamer, artistic type of a statement, but I think the same principle is there. He says, hey, don't worry about money. Just go do something. Give your all to it.
Give your all to it.
Become beautiful for 5 years at whatever you're trying to do. Someone will pay you. If you do one thing like mad for 5 years, you'll make money.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you'll make money because there's a market out there for you to do that. And then also to go back to the realism as well and the moralisms. Alan Watts was one of the most suspicious people in the world of do-gooders. He said, direct quote, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's him talking. And he's just like, wait, the scoundrels in the world are the ones out there saying, I'm here to help. I'm here to do something good. I'm trying to make the world a better place. That have these stated commitments, and that, and shielded behind that throughout, the drumbeat of history is, well, every major conflict that's ever existed. Right.
Yeah. I would like to end on the last quote about the profitable quarter.
Yeah.
That you read out. But before that, I would quickly like to cover Barricad's question. And sorry, it took us a while to get to it. And I find this an interesting question. He asked, is realism versus idealism a false dichotomy? And then he asked also, what is the opposite of realism? Could you elaborate on that?
Wow.
What would be the opposite of realism? I always assumed idealism.
Yeah, no, I mean, idealism is pretty damn good. It's definitely fair to say, again, Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
It's just a perfect example. That is an idealistic text of a state that never existed. And that's how Machiavelli starts The Prince. I'm here to write about something useful. I'm here to write about states that actually existed and how people and how leaders actually behaved, not how some book 2,000 years ago dreamed up a mythical vision of a state that's never existed ever in history. Oh, by the way, in Plato's Republic, for that to work, by the way, just taking Plato at his face value, it would require the forcible removal of all children from all parents. We forget about that.
Yeah.
It would require the banning of procreation of the undesirables. That's the ideal state. Let's keep that in mind. These beautiful idealists out there. So yeah, I'm with Alan Watts. People out there talking about idealism, they scare the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that have an idea that's really terrifying. And if I were to talk about two really big idealists, Hitler, Stalin, some serious idealists, they had a beautiful idealistic vision for the world according to them. But anyway, yeah. That's a useful
right. So I think
dichotomy.
It's a good time to end on probably one of the best quotes that exemplifies realism in the best way.
Yep.
Could you give it to us?
So, therefore, do not let our princes accuse fortune for the loss of their principalities after so many years' possession, but rather their own sloth, because in quiet times they never thought there could be a change. It is a common defect in man to not make any provision in the calm against the tempest. And well, actually, it's a great example of this. You know who I love? So many people can't stand this guy. Bill Belichick. I don't know anything about football, American football. I don't follow it. But I've read about some of Bill Belichick's philosophy, and actually, you can really just spend 5 seconds watching Watch Bill Belichick after winning the Super Bowl. Look at his face. It looks like my face right now. Like the moment he wins the Super Bowl, he's thinking about next season. Oh God, it's beautiful. And Nick Saban, similar, another great American football coach who wins all the time, right? So like, let's think about these people that win, and let's look at what they do. Let's even look at their facial expressions. They're not celebrating. They're thinking about what comes next, and okay, yeah, maybe that's not fun. Okay. And so realists are not fun sometimes. I get it. Right. But realists succeed a lot. And it's because when something good happens, they don't think, let's party, let's go to Vegas. Let's, live in the moment. Oh, be present in the moment. Just think no, we're aware of the future. In the future, we're going to die. In the future, there's enemies and unknowns and darkness and things that are changing that we don't have control over. Like, again, how much money do I need to make? I don't know. Who's trying to screw me 10 years from now? What problems exist in the world? Does my wife have cancer? No, but really, right? Those are the terms before us.
Absolutely. So,
has my house burned down? Have my parents been robbed? Was my sister murdered and now I'm in a legal battle?
Yeah.
But really, though, those things that's happening to people right now.
The thing is, no. I think the problem is you are now not doing the best advertisement for realism, because it does not have to be as dramatic and tragic. It can be, and at some point, yes, everybody will die. But the key thing is that even less bad things will happen and derail you. You might just lose your job. You might lose a loved one, but not a very close loved one. Those kind of things still will impact how you live your life and your ability to provide, your ability to prosper in the world. So it does not have to be the most extreme cases, but still be prepared for it.
But wait a minute, those extreme cases are inevitable. I might become sick for 2 years. My clients might go out of business. The entire, right, I'm heavily dependent on the Australian finance sector right now. A change in legislation or a bottoming out of the economy might just, for example, if they keep going into lockdown, so like these things happen. There's a great Jordan Peterson story where he was, he said he got a letter from somebody who he said that, his father died and his family was falling apart. And so there's no good. What's the good outcome here?
Yeah.
Right. So there's no good outcome there. But Peterson's advice to him was try to make it so you're the strongest person possible at the funeral. And so you're there to support as many people. And so it's as least bad as possible.
Yeah.
And that is the lot of our life. That is what's happening. Okay. So in a profitable quarter, double down. That's not something to celebrate.
Exactly.
You have to think about, well, we need another one and another one and another one, and it's okay. Great. You're profitable. Keep going. What's next, and this is obviously how, my business has been doing very well in the past few years and has been growing, quite rapidly. And I mean, every time I get a new client or I break another, personal objective for revenue, what's next?
Exactly.
I'm immediately there. Like, I mean, it's almost it is almost sometimes a little bit weird. Don't get me wrong. Like I don't know how to celebrate, honestly. And it is a strange thing, but it is because I'm constantly aware, wait a minute, there is a future. there is always this unknown future filled with potentially very disastrous things, from somewhat disastrous to extremely disastrous. And the best way I'm prepared against that is if I am maximizing my strength, my effectiveness, my talent, my knowledge, my profitability, my revenue streams, and simultaneously doing that for my clients. And well, that's how people should be thinking in business.
And it's
probably in
beautiful how a 2-hour conversation on realism can effectively be summarized and put a coda on by simply quoting the good old tale of the ant and the grasshopper. You don't know the tale of the ant and the grasshopper?
I don't think so. No, I don't.
Well, it's a fable by Aesop, where the ant is working, and the grasshopper is hopping around him all throughout the summer and telling him, "Look at you, why aren't you having fun?" And the ant says,
Okay.
"Winter is coming." And say, "Yeah, but when winter comes, it's all gonna be fine. We're gonna get through." And then winter comes, of course, and the ant has stacked up supplies. It's cold outside, and who comes knocking at the door? It's the grasshopper.
Yeah.
Who says, "Could you let me in? It's warm in your cabin, and I'm cold outside." And he says, it has a cruel ending, because the ant says, "Well, you insisted on having fun. This is what you reap what you sow." So it's a very simple story. I've learned it as a kid. We were read fables by Aesop fairly frequently, and so that was one of the core lessons, that it's as simple as that. You reap what you sow. And we see it's an application of a realist principle. Bad things will happen, not that they might, they will. So provide for that time.
Well, and I maybe have to add one more thing at the end of that, just because it reminds me of something else as well. Like just to not give a bad advertisement on realism, maybe I struggle with celebration. I get that, like I'm not going to go out there and be like, I accomplished this great thing, but I do really like my life. Really, like, it's just like, I'm having a lot of fun. Like, I love my work. I love my clients. It's challenging and engaging and unique. And I deal with such unique and curious problems almost randomly, day by day. It's remarkable, almost, like what I have in front of me. And my wife has not had to work for 5 years, and she will, if I keep doing this, she'll never have to have a regular job again. She gets to pursue purely artistic, creative pursuits. Which means also we eat very well, because she has time to cook. And I have a better meal than I think almost anyone in the world every single day. We play tennis every afternoon because we have the freedom to do that. We're building and designing our own house. It's our first house. How many people design their first home? And this is like our dream home, on a bunch of land in a forest in the middle of nowhere. We have privacy, so it's like, well, wait a minute, that's realism too. And because of that, if we look at all the economic upheavals that have occurred in the past few years, I've never needed to go protest on the streets. I've never needed to beg. I've never needed to ask for help. I haven't, and my wife hasn't either, by extension. And so it's just like, well, that's pretty damn fun. And again, I'm reminded of, like, a huge study was done into the people who became Nazis and communists. The people who took up extreme political views and became quite barbaric. And it's found that the people who did that were the ones who were unhappy and who didn't have very much economic mobility. So it's like, well, I might as well pick up arms. And so it's like, the greatest security against extreme forms of political government, the greatest security against predation, is to be strong and profitable. And that's realism.
A great place to end on. Thank you so much, Evan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great chat.
Enjoyed it.
I'm sure many people will benefit.
Yeah. We'll see.